From a promise to the God to the cross, you can to the day you call, so please and can I be peace. So we sing, can you write about it? Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari 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 Jaya Radha Hivardhani Jaya Hivardhani Jaya Radha Hivardhani Yashoda Brajajananda Yashoda Brajajananda Yamunatira Yamunatira Jaya Gopi Janava Sri Varda Jaya Gopi Janava Sri Varda Reading from Srila Prabhupada, Leelamrita, let there be a temple. It's in Vrindavan, August in Vrindavan. So which year, 1972, is it? Mm-hmm. 1974. 1974. Vrindavan. The political guests and military escort gone, the temple site returned to its usual quiet, and the devotees resumed their soft kirtan, chanting by Prabhupada's bedside. Amazed at Prabhupada's strength and determination, they realized how little they themselves were actually putting forth in Krishna consciousness. This is Srila Prabhupada was very, very sick. You know, he hadn't been attending the temple programs, and devotees had just been. He'd had a high fever, but when Srila Prabhupada heard that there were some dignitaries coming to visit the temple, then he immediately got dressed and came to receive them. But it actually took so much of his energy, and he was so sick that the devotees had to carry Prabhupada back to his room, and he collapsed with a 105-degree temperature. After 2 full weeks, Prabhupada's fever finally broke. The great ordeal was now over. The monsoon was ending, but the same problems of temple construction persisted. And so did Prabhupada's determination. His disciples also felt determined, and they resolved to work through all the bureaucratic delays and slow labor conditions. Now no one was going to neglect spiritual regulation. Prabhupada spoke no more about his illness, and devotees around the world were informed of his improvement. They could stop the emergency kirtans and go on with work as usual. Prabhupada also resumed his usual duties regarding the temple construction. One thing was clear, however, Prabhupada was completely spiritual, and the devotees working with him had engaged in a spiritual contract, a contract based on love and trust. He was taking their karma, and they had promised to follow his instructions. Now, despite his disappointment in them for their failures, that contract was still in order. If he continued to give his causes mercy, then they could carry out his orders. Otherwise, they were without spiritual strength. For Prabhupada, there was never a question of not continuing. Even when he had suffered illness on his disciples' account, he had never thought to abandon them. After more than 2 weeks of not translating, Prabhupada resumed his work. He had been working quickly on the Chaitanya Charitamrita and was up to the discussions between Lord Chaitanya and Sanatana Goswami in Madhya Lila. Taking up where he had left off, Prabhupada again began rising early and studying the Bengali translations and commentaries. He would turn on his dictating machine and begin to speak. His voice attained a harsh whisper. But as he continued, his voice grew stronger, until by the end of an hour he was speaking normally. By the time he left Vrindavan, he was working unusually fast, producing 2 tapes a day. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, Chapter 2, Text 2, chapter entitled The Activities of Maharaj Agnidhara. Is this? It's actually in the book. It's written in 3 lines. Here it's 4. Maybe somebody's decided that you can sing it in a meter. Anyway, we'll see.
I think it's just verse in
Oh,
here.
I
This
see.
is 2.
Sorry? Can you? Okay, true. Sa
Sa
cha
cha
kadachit
dachit
pitriloka
vitriloka
kama
kama
suravara.
survara
Sa cha kadachit pitriloka kama suravara.
sacha dachit vitriloka kama survara
Sacha kadachit pitriloka kama suravara.
sacha dachit vitriloka kama survara
Vanita kridachala
Vanita Kritachala
dronyam
Janyam
bhagavantam
Bhagavatam
vishvasrijam.
Vishvasrijam
Okay. Vanita kridachala dronyam bhagavantam vishvasrijam.
Vanita Kritachala Bhagavatam Vishvasrijam
Patim
Patim
abrita
Avrita
paricharyo pakarana
Ashcharyopadanam
atmaika griyena.
Atmaika Gena
Patima Brita Paricharyo Pakarana
Patim Vrita Paricharyopadanam
Patima Brita Paricharyo Pakarana
Patim Vrita Paricharyopadanam
Atmaika Griyena
Atmaika Gena
Tapasvi
Tapasvi
Aradayam Prabhuva Atmaika Griyena Tapasvya Aradayam Bhuva Atmaika Griyena Tapasvya Aradayam Bhuva Sacha kadachit pitriloka kama suravara. Vanita kridachala dronyam bhagavantam vishvasrijam. Patima Brita Paricharya Pakarana Atmaika Griyena Tapasvyaradayam Bhuva Sacha Kadachit Pitriloka Kama Suravara Vanita Kridachala Dronyam Bhagavantam Vishvasrijam Patima Brita Paricharya Pakarana Atmaika Griyena Tapasvyaradayam Bhuva Satyakachit pichiloka kama surava Nati krikita chaladronyam bhagavantam vishvasrijam Patimamrita paricharyo pukarana Atmaikagriya tapasya radayam babuva Vaishnavis
Satyakachit pichiloka kama surava
Satyakachit pichiloka kama surava
Vanita Krita Chala Jomya Bhagavanta Vishvasrijam
Vanita krita chaladronyam bhagavantam vishvasrijam
Satyanga Krita Paricharya Pakarna Atmaika Kriyana Tapasya Pradayam Babuva
Atmaikagriya tapasya radayam babuva So, he King Agnidra also Kadachit once upon a time Pitriloka the Pitriloka planet Kama desiring Surabara of the great demigods Vanita the women Akrida the place of pastimes Achaladronyam in one valley of the Mandara hill Bhagavantam unto the most powerful Lord Brahma Vishvasrijam of personalities who have created this universe Tim the Master Abrita having collected Paricharya Upakarana ingredients for worship Atma of the mind Eka Agriyena with full attention Tapasvi one who executes austerity Aradayam Bhaguva became engaged in worshipping. Translation desiring to get a perfect son and become an inhabitant of Pitriloka, Maharaj Agnidra once worshipped Lord Brahma, the master of those in charge of material creation. He went to a valley of Mandara hill, where the damsels of the heavenly planets come down to stroll. There he collected garden flowers and other necessary paraphernalia, and then engaged in severe austerities and worship. Brought by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. The king became Pitriloka Kama, or desirous of being transferred to the planet named Pitriloka. Pitriloka is mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita. Yanti Deva Vrata Deva, Pitrin Yanti Pitri Vrata. To go to this planet, one needs very good sons who can make offerings to Lord Vishnu and then offer the remnants to their forefathers. The purpose of the Shraddha ceremony is to please the personality of Godhead Lord Vishnu, so that after pleasing him, one may offer prasad to one's forefathers and in this way make them happy. The inhabitants of Pitriloka are generally men of the Karma Kandya or fruit of activities category who have been transferred there because of their pious activities. They can stay there as long as their descendants offer them Vishnu Prasad. Everyone in heavenly planets, such as Pitriloka, however, must return to earth after exhausting the effects of his pious acts. As confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 9.21, Shine Punya Mate Lokam Vishanti. Persons who perform pious acts are transferred to higher planets. When the effects of their pious acts are over, they are again transferred to earth. Since Maharaj Priyavrata was a great devotee, how could he have begotten a son who desired to be transferred to Pitriloka? Lord Krishna says, Pitrinyanti Pitrivrataha. Persons who desire to go to Pitriloka are transferred there. Similarly, Yanti Madhyajino Bhiman. Persons who desire to be transferred to the spiritual planets, Vaikuntha Lokas, can also go there. Can also go there. That means go to Vaikuntha. Since Maharaj Agnidra was the son of a Vaishnava, he should have desired to be transferred to the spiritual world, Vaikuntha Loka. Why then did he desire to be transferred to Pitriloka? In answer to this, Goswami Giridhar, one of the Bhagavatam commentators, remarks that Agnidra was born when Maharaj Priyavrata was infatuated by lusty desires. This may be accepted as a fact because sons are begotten with different mentalities according to the time of their conception. According to the Vedic system, therefore, before a child is conceived, the Bhagavatam Samskar is performed. This ceremony molds the mentality of the father in such a way that when he plants his seed in the womb of his wife, he will beget a child whose mind will be completely saturated with a devotional attitude. At the present moment, however, there are no such Bhagavatam Samskaras, and therefore people generally have a lusty attitude when they beget children. Especially in this age of Kali, there are no Bhagavatam ceremonies. Everyone enjoys sex with his wife like a cat or a dog. Therefore, according to Shastric injunctions, almost all the people of this age belong to the Shudra category. Of course, although Maharaj Agnidra had a desire to be transferred to Pitriloka, this does not mean that his mentality was that of a Shudra. He was a Kshatriya. Maharaj Agnidra desired to be transferred to Pitriloka, and therefore he needed a wife, because anyone desiring to be transferred to Pitriloka must leave behind a good son to offer yearly pinda or prasad from Lord Vishnu. To have a good son, Maharaj Agnidra wanted a wife from a family of demigods. Therefore he went to Mandra Hill, where the women of the demigods generally come to worship Lord Brahma. In Bhagavad Gita 4.12 it is said, Kangshamta kamanam siddhim yajanti yadevata. Materialists who want quick results in the material world worship demigods. This is also confirmed in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Shri Aishwarya Prajapsava. Those who desire beautiful wives, substantial wealth, and many sons worship the demigods. But an intelligent devotee, instead of being entangled by the happiness of this material world in the form of a beautiful wife, material opulence and children, desires to be immediately transferred back home, back to Godhead. Thus he worships the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vishnu. Okay. So actually, I had a misunderstanding. When I was reading this passage, there's a sentence here. Therefore, Maharaj Agnidra went to Mandra Hill, where the women of the demigods generally come to worship Lord Brahma. It's it's not that he was going to Mandra Hill. He wasn't going to Mandra Hill to worship Lord Brahma. He was going to there because he knew the women of the demigods went there to Lord Brahma, to worship Lord Brahma. So just to make that clear, because the way I emphasized that sentence was not according to not the correct understanding. Yeah. So Amagyanatimrandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chishurmanitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Gudamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Shri Rupam Sagojatam Sahaganam Raganatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sarvetam Savadutam Brijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Valita Shri Shakram Vitam Shakapatarubyascha Kapasinaviyavicha Paditanabhavadevi Vaishnava Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Sarigaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So it's interesting that Srila Prabhupada describes that according to one of our acharyas, Giridhari Goswami, that Maharaj Abhidra had this desire for elevation to the Pitriloka planets because his father, Maharaj Priyavrata, conceived him when he was infatuated by lusty desires. So this is actually Krishna's arrangement, because if you read, when we're reading the last chapter, that we see that actually Maharaj Priyavrata, he was before he got married, he was very renounced, engaged in devotional service, a pure devotee, and was his desire was to continue performing devotional service to the end of his life. Not to get married, but to go back to the spiritual world and not to risk being entangled in material activities. But it was the desire of Krishna that he got married and accept the kingdom, rule the kingdom, and engage in all of the duties of the king and the royal orders. So he did get married, although it took quite some persuasion, actually. Narada Muni and Lord Brahma had to come personally to persuade him. And then, so while Maharaj Priyavrata, this is the father of Maharaj Abhidra, while Maharaj Priyavrata was executing his duties as the king, as the actual emperor of the whole planet, and so the emperor of the planet at that time, didn't have such a hard job as like the World Health Association has now, to try to keep everybody under control. Because people, as we read from this purport, people were actually following strictly the rules and regulations of the different Vedic injunctions, even though people had a desire for sense gratification to some degree, but they understood that to be able to fulfill their desires, they had to very strictly follow the different systems of the different khandas of the Vedas. So whether they were desiring liberation from the material universe, or whether they were desiring elevation to higher planets, they were all almost without exception, all of the inhabitants of the planet at this time were following regulative principles. So that the king, if the king was a devotee and the king understood his relationship with the citizens and his relationship with the demigods and his relationship with Lord Narayan, then his service was clear. There was no real lack of clarity as to what the service of the king was. However, by the arrangement of the Supreme Lord, then Maharaj Priyavrata actually became a little infatuated by the opulence of being the king, and especially by the opulence of his beautiful wife and his family members. And so he relaxed his determination to remain on the very narrow path, and he became contaminated. Became contaminated by the association of persons who weren't on the same high standard as himself. And because of that, at that time, like late afterwards, almost as soon as Maharaj Priyavrata understood that, according to the account in the previous chapter, when Maharaj Priyavrata understood that this was happening, that his consciousness was being degraded, then he decided he was going to renounce family life. But just at that moment, just before that happened, and by the Lord's arrangement, his wife conceived a child, and Maharaj Agnija was conceived at that time. And the spirit soul, the jiva, the spark of consciousness entered the womb of Maharaj Priyavrata's wife. And according to the law of karma, the universal law of karma, and then the living entity who enters the womb, then there's a perfect arrangement that the desire of that living entity who's going to enter the womb at the time of conception is actually coincides with the consciousness of the parents at that time. And for that reason, Krishna and Lord Brahma have designed this system of samskaras, whereby at different stages of the life of the child, beginning from conception and right until death, there are certain ceremonies that are performed to adjust the consciousness or adjust the external circumstances, so that the jiva who's inhabiting that body throughout its life is kind of brought back on track. But it's not that we can rely on those samskars. There's actually there's 18 of them, and they're not. Most people, like within present day Vaishnava society, especially people who've been born into a Vaishnava family, then they'll follow some of them, but it's very rare to meet anyone who's actually follows all of them. But whenever one of these ceremonies is due, right, so at different times in life, for example, at the time of birth, then the astrologer comes to read the child's chart, and then very shortly after that, give the child a name, and then there's different cutting of the hair, then there's the first visit to the temple, or the first going out of the house, and the first visiting of the temple, the first solid food, anaprashna, and then there's the second haircutting ceremony. The first haircutting ceremony is just cutting the very soft hairs of the child, but a little later there's Chudakarana. Chudakarana means to make a tuft, right? It's to make a tuft of hair. So at that time, this is this is letting the child know that now you're part of the Vaishnava community. And then after that, there's Vidyaramba, beginning of education, and then there's Upanayanam. It's like receiving entrance into the tradition of Brahminical education. And then there's marriage, Vivaha, and then there's Antyeshti, which is like the final passage of death. So, but we can't rely on these 18 different sanskars for keeping the individual in line, and for keeping the society in line. It's the nature of the material world that everything is deteriorating. And here in the Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 3, verse 34, Indriyasya te ragadvesha vyavastito tayonava shamagache tauyasya paripantino. There are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks on the path of realization. As long as the material body is there, the necessities of the material body are allowed, but under rules and regulations, and yet we should not rely upon the control of such allowances. One has to follow those rules and regulations unattached to them, because practice of sense gratification under regulations may also lead one to go astray, as much as there is always the chance of an accident, even on the royal roads. Although they may be very carefully maintained, no one can guarantee that there will be no danger even on the safest road. The sense enjoyment spirit has been current a very long time owing to material association. Therefore, in spite of regulated sense enjoyment, there is every chance of falling down. Therefore, any attachment for regulated sense enjoyment must also be avoided by all means. But attachment to Krishna consciousness, or acting always in the loving service of Krishna, detaches one from all kinds of sensory activities. Therefore, no one should try to be detached from Krishna consciousness at any stage of life. The whole purpose of detachment from all kinds of sense attachment is ultimately to become situated on the platform of Krishna consciousness. So, like the great Kshatriya kings who we read about throughout the Vedic literature, in the Bhagavatam, the Mahabharata, the Puranas, they were following these samskaras because they had their royal pandits, Raj pandits, who would, come whenever the time for the different sanskar was there, and they'd be performed perfectly, all of the... So they were following the rules and regulations. But often what happens is, then these events are also big social events. And these, just like just like we have birthday parties in the West, and other things like graduation and marriage, and getting a new house. Then and we know all of the kind of social interaction that goes on around these kind of events. So in the Vedic system, there's actually 18 of these celebrations, and they're all social events. So therefore, there is a danger that the association that one engages in at these events becomes very materialistic, and the actual spiritual purpose of the samskars becomes covered. Therefore, Srila Prabhupada here in the Bhagavad Gita is warning us that although they may be very carefully maintained, he's talking about roads here, road repair. Although the roads may be very carefully maintained, no one can guarantee that there will be no danger even on the safest road. So in one sense, the Kshatriyas, the emperors, they were on the safest road, you could say, like the son of an emperor. Every aspect of his education and his physical and emotional well-being was catered for. But as we know from history, this was no guarantee that there wouldn't be some unforeseen tragedy. And so therefore, Srila Prabhupada recommends, he prescribes that danger is always going to be there. You can't rely on your good karma, you can't rely on your good family or your good education or your good geographical location. You can't rely on any of these things for real success and happiness in life. But one thing that you can perform, which will guarantee these things, is always acting in the loving service of Krishna. Because this, for many different reasons. One reason is that if we're always acting in the loving service of Krishna, then we're in the association of Krishna's pure devotees. And when they see that we are sincerely engaged in the loving service of Krishna, then they will pray to Krishna, pray to Srimati Radharani, pray to Lord Chaitanya for our well-being. And Krishna's inclined, Krishna always responds to the prayers of his pure devotees. So this is the only safe path in the material world, is to be always acting in the loving service of Krishna. So I'll stop there. Are there any questions or comments? Peter?
Yes. I have a question about this planet Pitloka. Could you please explain a little bit more why Maharaj wanted to go to this planet?
Well, one reason it's called Pitloka, it means sometimes it's called the planet of the forefathers, which means that one's ancestors are there. So it's like it's a heavenly planet, and there's opportunity for sense gratification there, and there's opportunity for material sense gratification at a much higher level than there is here in the material planets. One reason that people want to go to Pitloka is because they hear about it all the time. It's kind of like in one sense, is the easiest heavenly planet to get to. And the other, because all the other heavenly planets are the higher heavenly planets where the prominent demigods reside, then those higher planets, the inhabitants there all have a particular service, and you can't attain those higher planets unless you have like a higher qualification. But just by performing the sanskars, just by following the rules and regulations of the karma kanda rituals that you see performed in many Hindu temples around the world. Although a lot of those rituals have become kind of confused and a little polluted, but actually there is quite a lot of austerity involved in following them, and there's a great, within the Hindu diaspora, amongst the Indians who've left India to work in the Western world, then often they're, very, very serious about observing many of the karma kanda rituals, and the men, and especially this concept of maintaining their parents in Pitriloka is very, very strong. Actually, it's interesting, there's when Krishna comes to visit Vasudeva and Devaki in Mathura, just prior to the killing of Kamsa. Krishna at that time says that if we don't satisfy our parents, then we have to go to hell, and if we don't satisfy our parents, we have to go to hell. And that conception is extremely strong in kind of conventional Hindu society. That if we don't fulfill our duty to our parents, then whatever wealth we accumulate in this life, it's all going to come to an end. But Srila Prabhupada throughout his books stresses that although this is a pious intention and a pious observation, it can't actually last. It's because it doesn't satisfy the soul. It's like there's too much guilt involved in it. It actually it destroys the bhakti when you're always doing something out of fear all the time. And especially when it requires so many different rituals to be performed, it kind of destroys the bhakti. But Srila Prabhupada did actually, in the purport in the 7th canto, when after Lord Nrsingadev had dealt with Hiranyakashipu, and Lord Nrsingadev told Prahlad to perform the ceremonies for his father. And in the purport to that verse, Srila Prabhupada says that there are many different observations, sanskars, which are there in the Vedic literature, and although we're not practicing them now, we shouldn't practice them. So Srila Prabhupada did actually say that we should practice these rituals, but the goal is not to go to Pitriloka. The purpose is to, throughout the child's life, to have certain days when all of the Vaishnavas will come together and have a nice ceremony. And those persons who are materialistic, who come because they want to go to Pitriloka, they can come, but we always try to make it a nice Krishna conscious festival, so that people will get to hear about Krishna as well as getting to hear about Pitriloka. So in this way we don't need to reject the different sections of the Vedas, but we try to channel them to the higher goal of Krishna consciousness.
Yeah, so thank you. I feel like sometimes we have to fulfill some more duties before going to Krishna Loka. That's why we might go to a different planet first.
Yes, but that's true.
To go to Krishna Loka immediately.
Yeah, so well, that's why we need a spiritual master, because the spiritual master understands our degree of surrender. If he sees that if our spiritual master sees that we're very determined to adopt the path of pure devotional service, then he'll just encourage us in that direction. But if he sees that we're constantly being attracted to sense enjoyment, and anyway, I'm not a spiritual master, so it's not for me to say. But generally, Srila Prabhupada would encourage all of his disciples to go towards the path of pure devotional service, and then just go in that direction with as much energy as possible. And then if for some reason you don't reach the goal in this lifetime, there'll be no loss. But if you try to take up the path of fulfilling your parents, and how many ancestors do you have to fulfill? It's not just your parents, but your grandparents and your great-grandparents, because we've been born into a culture where we haven't been following all of those obligations for perhaps 6, 7, 8 generations. We don't know. I mean, we may have been in an Indian family in previous lives, but we don't know. So we may have so many obligations. We'll be here for another few kalpas to be able to fulfill all of our obligations. So yeah, let's just put all of our energy into the process that Srila Prabhupada has given us. And he said, many times, even if you don't manage 100%, then he will actually, pray to Krishna that Krishna will accept you because of your sincerity. And the thing is that we'll be part of the family of pure devotees, even if we have to come back to take birth again in the material world. But we'll be under the care, under the guardianship of the pure devotees. So we're completely safe, in that. We're completely safe in that relationship. So that's why it's always act in loving service for Krishna, always try to please Krishna's pure devotees. Okay, I'll stop there now. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Nitai Gaura Premanam. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai.